In the first two parts, I showed you how I developed the plate and the idea for Labyrinth Valley. I showed you some of the tools and how I used them on this plate. So now we're back. We'll take a look next at how I printed the plate and flattened the prints in the edition. Since about 1983, Graphic Chemical and Ink Company has been producing the same kind of ink that I used to grind by hand. It's now available through their catalog. I always adjust the ink by adding some kind of ink conditioner. For Labyrinth Valley, I added 1 part of SureSet to 3 parts of ink from the can. This ink has a tendency to fall asleep after it's been ground, so I wake it up by pressing it vigorously with a putty knife against the marble mixing slab. I'll continue drawing it out against the slab until it has a smooth consistency. When a blob of ink is picked up from the slab, the string that hangs down should break at about 6 inches or less. So now we've mixed the ink. I dabbed some of the ink on the plate, being careful not to touch the plate with the steel knife. I placed ink where a plastic squeegee could spread it evenly along each edge of the plate, from top to bottom, and over the entire surface. So now that I've got the ink on the plate, it's time to wipe it off. This rag is a tarlatan. At first I use heavy pressure and try to make certain that all lines have been filled with ink. Then I lighten the pressure and use the tarlatan to remove excess ink. Now the image has become visible, so I switched to a cleaner tarlatan and used much lighter pressure. After several minutes, the surface was giving off a soft, warm glow. When all parts of the surface were consistent, I knew the wiping was finished. I wiped the edges with a paper tissue. We're going to the press bed. A piece of mylar has been marked to serve as a template showing where to place the plate and the paper. The paper I chose for this edition was Somerset satin. I dampened the sheets of paper before printing on them. This shows the copper plate and the damp paper on the press bed. I always use 2 woven blankets as shown here. This old etching press is more than 40 years old. It's still sturdy and it still applies consistent pressure. It took about 12 minutes to pull each proof from the plate. When the blankets are removed, the paper appears to be molded to the plate. I use paper tabs to keep inky fingers from soiling the printing paper. This proof was taken from the finished state of the plate. Usually, I pull 2 or 3 proofs of each new state and draw on them with charcoal or pencil to try out different ideas. Now I'll show you the early states. This proof shows the first state. The labyrinths have been worked out and engraved with the burin, but the valleys remain uncut. I inspected the spot that had that imperfection, a pit, in the plate. After seeing this proof, I decided to leave it alone and not scrape into it any further. There are also 3 light blemishes in the upper left corner. I decided to remove those with the burnisher. I darkened a few lines on the proof with a pencil. Then, using a digital camera, scanner, and inkjet printer, I made 3 copies and drew on each of those, trying out a different idea on each. This was the first version. It stayed fairly close to the original drawing in the tiny sketchbook. This is the second version. I like the dramatic contrast between fine lines in the man-made forms and the bold calligraphic lines in the nature forms. It was very tempting. But I was curious to see if a third version might be preferable. In this third drawing, all of the natural forms in the valleys are being rendered into rhythmic calligraphic lines. I liked it. It had more linear energy, but it felt less mysterious. It was a difficult decision because I liked all three of them. Well, ultimately, I decided to use the first version, the one that was closest to the original drawing in the sketchbook. I was hooked by its stronger feeling of mystery. Here's the next proof, which is labeled State 2. State 3 on the right is the finished state for this edition. The paper I'm printing on has a habit of being wavy after the prints have dried, so I prefer to flatten them out. After the ink is dried for 3 or 4 days, I mist them with water and stack them for a few minutes. This type of press was used in banks and professional institutions to make copies of documents. I use it to flatten prints between boards and blotters. The blotters have been heated so that they are super dry. Then the boards and blotters are stacked together with the dampened prints. I usually reheat and restack the blotters several times until the prints contain less humidity than the surrounding air. So there you have it, the whole story about how Labyrinth Valley was inspired, engraved, and printed. The only thing remaining is to sign the prints in the edition.